Shintō in History, Ways of the Kami, edited by John Breen and Mark Teeuwen. Introduction: Shintō Past and Present by John Breen and Mark Teeuwen. The Shintō Present. The place of Shintō in the religious scene of contemporary Japan as a vibrant, independent, and coherent religion would seem self-evident. Shrines, the concrete symbols of Shintō, dot the landscape of urban and rural Japan. Shintō shrines, with their distinctive torii, the gates, and shimenawa, the ropes, can be discreet, nestled in wooded precincts, or tucked away behind rows of shops. They can also be more imposing, defining the landscape in which they are set. The ancient shrines at Ise and Izumo are, and more modern creations like the Meiji and Yasukuni shrines in Tokyo are examples of the latter type. The material symbols which such shrines have in common and which distinguish them from other religious structures, like those of Buddhism, say, attest to a shared heritage. Shrine priests across Japan are distinguished from Buddhist monks, other religious figures, and the laity by black eboshi, the hats, garments of white silk, and the shaku, a wooden implement priests carry on ceremonial occasions. It is evident, then, to even the most casual observer that Japan's 100,000 or so shrines and their attendant priests do indeed belong to one and the same tradition. The organizational structure one would accept of an independent and coherent religion is apparent too. Some 75% of a nation's shrines and priests belong to Jinja Honjo, a charitable organization based in Tokyo. The majority of the remainder of shrines are dedicated to the rice deity Inari and are affiliated to the Fushimi Inari Shrine in Kyoto. There are also two institutions that train men and women from all over Japan for the shrine priesthood: Kokugakuin University in Tokyo and Kogakkan University in Ise. Again, there is manifest the uniformity of practice to be expected of a coherent and distinct religious tradition, from participants' washing of hands and rinsing of mouths on passing under the torii, through the casting of coins and ringing of the deity's summoning bell, the suzu, to the clapping of hands and bowing of heads as greeting to the kami deities. Events in the annual and life cycles provide the main structures for such shrine practice. Shrines have their own special feast days to mark founding and other unique events. But there is, for the rest, a striking synchronicity amongst shrines through Japan. New Year, the Dolls Festival in March, the Hinamatsuri, Children's Day in May, Tango no Sekku, the Tanabata and Bon festivals in July, and the Autumn Harvest Festival, all of which draw many contemporary Japanese to shrines. Likewise, the birth of a child, special November ceremonies in a child's 3rd, 5th, and 7th years, coming of age ceremonies on 15 January, and weddings too provide opportunities for shrines, their priests, and parishioners all over Japan to engage in the practice of what we now know as Shintō. To the extent that such practice is sustained by any sort of theology at all, and not simply by a need to confirm and strengthen family, communal, or even national ties, it is apparently a straightforward and simple one. The kami, whatever their identity and provenance, will, when addressed with correct etiquette, appropriate prayers, and adequate offerings, deign to confer blessings on the supplicant. Invariably, the blessings sought and won are of a this-worldly variety: success in exams, recovery from sickness, longevity, the flourishing of a business, a happy marriage, or an easy birth are typical examples. Yet, another dimension of Shintō is suggested by the typical location of shrines in the heart of a natural environment, at the feet or on the summits of mountains, backed up against wooded copses, in the vicinity of waterfalls. Shrine practice invests in mountains, trees, rocks, and other natural phenomena a sacred quality and identifies them as the dwelling places of kami. These facts point up a defining relationship between Shintō and nature, which is everywhere underscored and articulated in the available literature on Shintō in Western languages. The same literature points to still another dimension of Shintō, thought and ritual, much less evident to the casual observer: the centrality of the imperial institution. We are told that imperial myths such as Daijōsai, enthronement, and imperial deities, foremost among whom is Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and imperial shrines like that of Amaterasu in Ise, constitute Shintō's most holy texts and practices, its central deities and most sacred places. a cursory explanation of the imperial ritual in contemporary Japan. The enthronement rituals for the present emperor, Akihito, say, is sufficient to confirm that it does indeed share key symbols with local shrine cults. From the involvement of ritualists clad in eboshi and white silk garb, to the emperor veneration of Amaterasu, both in the palace and subsequently to at Ise, the symbolic commonality is evident. It is here, in the literature on the centrality of the imperial institution in Shintō, that we stumble upon a suggestive anomaly. For, despite the evident and significant commonality on the symbolic level, there is no evidence at all that such shrine practices and kami beliefs, as are common among the Japanese today, are dominated by or even consciously related to imperial themes. Still, lesser local practices and beliefs sustained by belief in or even intimate acquaintance with imperial practices and beliefs. The slippage here is that between a self-consciously Shintō establishment and the national, not to say nationalistic, agenda professed by the majority of its members on the one hand, and local shrines and the practices and beliefs of ordinary Japanese who venerate there on the other. There is further striking evidence of a dislocation between image and reality, between what are central and local agendas. The Shintō establishment lays claim to some 110 million Shintō practitioners, a figure which corresponds to some 90% of the population of Japan. This statistic is reproduced annually in government surveys on religious affiliation. Yet, all the indications are that Shintō, as opposed to, say, Jinja or Kami, has no meaning at all for the vast majority of Japanese, regardless of generation. Japanese attend shrines and beseech kami at festivals and on other occasions too, but they have no awareness that their practice constitutes something called Shintō, or that they themselves are Shintōists. They certainly do not themselves profess affiliation to the Shintō religion. The striking statistic, it turns out, is obtained by the government's Office for Cultural Affairs, Bunkacho, asking shrine priests to submit parishioner numbers. These figures themselves are obtained from local government population registers. These slippages suggest that there is an obvious case for deploying the term Shintō with very considerable caution in discussion of contemporary Japanese religiosity. We argue that it is vital to distinguish between shrine cults, the reality of those multifarious activities and beliefs that are manifest in shrines, both local and central, and Shintō, the ideological agenda of the establishment, rooted especially through certainly not uniquely in reverence for, or at least identification with, the imperial institution. There is, of course, no denying the continuities across shrines, from the smallest rural shrine to that of the imperial ancestress in Ise, in terms of symbols, practices, and indeed beliefs, at least at a basic level. And yet, it remains that these continuities fail conspicuously to converge with the establishment's articulation of Shintō. We clearly overlook this leakage, these tensions and contradictions, at our peril. Shintō is not, then, in any obvious sense, what contemporary Japanese do at shrines, nor what they think before the kami, since it is not what they themselves understand that they do and think. Shintō is, rather, what the contemporary establishment and its spokesman would have them think and do. The main focus of our concern in this book is Shintō in history, not in the present, but any historical exploration might usefully begin with an awareness that the contemporary dislocation between center and periphery, image and reality, is not a new phenomenon. It is a contemporary manifestation of an age-old dimension to the problem of Shintō, present and past. The Shintō past. Until the relatively recent publication of a series of seminal articles by the historian Kuroda Toshio, the Shintō establishment's construction of the Shintō past went unchallenged by specialists writing in Japanese, English, and other Western languages. To this day, that construction remains largely unquestioned in non-specialist literature. There is some value, therefore, in a brief rehearsal of both the establishment position and Kuroda's incisive critique of it. In a nutshell, establishment spokesmen like Hirai Naofusa have disseminated the view in English as well as Japanese that Shintō is the indigenous religion of Japan and has continued in an unserved line from prehistorical times to the present. But Shintō is unique in, say, its attachment to nature, and, as such, constitutes the basis of Japanese culture. Hirai and others argue further that Shintō constitutes, and has always done so, the ultimate expression of Japanese unique polity, centered on the imperial institution. Critical to the persuasiveness of the argument of Hirai and others like Joseph Kitagawa, who follow him very closely, are the structural subdivisions of Shintō: Shrine Shintō, Folk Shintō, and Sect Shintō. Shrine Shintō has existed, according to Hirai, from the beginning of Japanese history, and has its most lofty expression in the religious devotions of the imperial family to Amaterasu. By Folk Shintō or popular Shintō, the structure of Shintō faith, Hirai seems to refer to all other practices before the kami that do not take place at established shrines. Sect Shintō, finally, comprises the 13 new Shintō-type religious sects that sprang up in the social tumult of the 19th century. In this seamless multi-layered vision offered by the establishment, there is no room for dynamism, contradictions, or tensions. The emphasis is on continuity and challengelessness rather than change. Kuroda's main counter to this view is articulated in English in a seminal article entitled Shintō in the History of Japanese Religion, is that Shintō, as the distinct, autonomous and independent religion we know today, is an invention of 19th century Japanese ideologues. Before the Meiji policy that authorized the separation of Shintō and Buddhism, Japanese religious culture had been to all intents and purposes defined by Buddhism. Shrines and shrine-based practice were nothing more than Buddhism's secular phase. Kami, for their part, were understood to be manifestations of the Buddha. The path to the revolutionary change in early Meiji was paved, of course, with the writings of various intellectuals in the preceding Edo period. Men like Motoori Norinaga, who conceived of kami and shrines as constituting a tradition quite distinct from and unquestionably superior to Buddhism. It was Motoori and others like him who firmly fixed the definition of Shintō and the indigenous religion of Japan. These men owed an intellectual debt in return to the writing of men like Yoshida Kanetomo. But Shintō theorists of the medieval period prior to Yoshida, such as the Watari school and the outer shrine of Ise, were all adherents of the orthodox Buddhist teachings. None of these men questioned for a moment that Buddhism constitutes the overarching principle. It is nonsensical, Kuroda asserts, to talk of Shintō as though it existed as an independent religion at this, or indeed at any earlier age in Japanese history. Contrary to the claims of some, then, the state formalization of kami rituals and the state ranking of shrines during the Heian period did not mark Shintō's emergence as an independent indigenous religion. Indeed, These developments coincided precisely with new theological formulations that sought to explain kami in Buddhist terms, defining the kami as transformations of the Buddhas manifested in Japan to save all sentient beings. Kuroda's critique of the religious situation in pre-Heian Japan is more provocative still. Shintō, in its earliest usage in, say, the Nihon Shoki, was, he insists, a referent not for some indigenous creed at all, but rather for Taoism. The characters read as Shintō in Japanese were used in 8th century China to mean Taoism, and it would have been natural for Japanese to use the same term in the same way. Teachings, rituals, and even the concept of imperial authority, everything from the veneration of swords and mirrors to religious titles and the physical structure of the most sacred shrine of Ise, all spring from Taoism. So too were local beliefs defined by Taoist influence. Taoism totally pervaded early Japan's religious milieu, obliterating what indigenous practices may have existed prior to that foreign creed's advent. Shintō, in its earliest known usage, was then nothing but a Chinese cultural import. The new enthusiasm for the study of Shintō in academic circles outside Japan is due, in no small degree, to Kuroda's groundbreaking contribution. For all its incisiveness, however, Kuroda's approach is itself not problem-free. It leaves us with a portrayal of Japanese religious history potentially as devoid of dynamism as that of Hirai and the Shintō establishment. Hirai posits Shintō as the seamless cultural religious historical backdrop against which all religious phenomena, including Buddhism, are subtly transformed even as they were effortlessly accommodated. Kuroda, in his turn, accords to Buddhism a function not altogether dissimilar. Buddhism is the overarching defining influence within which all other religious phenomena were transformed in time, even to the point of obliteration. Kuroda dissembles the construct of the continuous Shintō tradition, stating that it is no more than a ghost image produced by a word linking together unrelated phenomena. But in the process, he comes very close to writing out of Japanese history not only Shintō, but shrines, the priests, kami, and distinctive religious practices as well. Based Kuroda, it is vital that we remember that many shrines, priestly lineages, kami beliefs, and rites do display a remarkable degree of continuity over very long periods of time. There is similar a striking degree for continuity over time in the imperial institution. Its symbols, myths, and some of its rites. It is incumbent on us to explore these continuities and their interrelationship further. With regard to the former, the symbols of Tori and Shimenawa are of verifiably ancient pedigree. So, again, is local shrine practice and belief unquestionably ancient, at least in such basic terms as the supplicant's recognition of the need for purification before supplication, say, or the summoning of kami by hand clapping, and the propitiation of the kami, whatever their provenance, for benefits of a this-worldly nature. The identification evidenced by shrine location between beliefs, practices, and the natural environment is also verifiably ancient. To insist on the existence of continuity in local symbolism, practice, and belief is not, of course, to deny the possibility of more or less profound influences from, say, Buddhism, Taoism, or other imported practices at various historical stages. It is not, in other words, to deny the reality of change that lies at the heart of any tradition. With regard to the imperial institution, we need to note that it was in the late 7th to early 8th century that the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki texts were written. These shrines were commandeered by the ruling elite as the ancestral shrine of the imperial family, and the annual Ni-Namesai ritual, as well as its grander version, the once-in-a-reign Daijōsai, was reformulated and staged as a celebration of the emperor's privileged relationship with the sun goddess Amaterasu. While it is true that there were historical breaks in the performance of, say, the Daijōsai, it remains that the symbols of the imperial institution, whatever their ultimate provenance, have their roots firmly embedded in ancient Japan. Again, it is important to bear in mind that from Japan's ancient period, this imperial symbolism, however indebted to Taoist ideas, was never superseded. It was never overtly challenged or discredited by any group of intellectuals, nor was it at any time replaced. This applies to all intellectuals, but most obviously to those various self-consciously Shintō groups of men that formed at different stages of Japanese history. The man who ran the Jingikan, or Department of the Affairs of the Deities, in the classical period, for example, the Watarai priests at Ise in the medieval period, or the Yoshida and Shirakawa priests, and the nativist exponents of the pre-modern period. None of these groups overcame imperial symbolism or denied its validity, but it remains incumbent upon us to consider critically the place of imperial symbolism in their thinking and writing. The nature of a metaphysical, or more practical, negotiations these thinkers conducted, willingly or otherwise, with regard to the imperial institution and its symbolism, is one of several areas demanding our concern. Another in the relationship between the imperial center and the aforementioned groups of intellectuals on the one hand, and rural local shrine cults on the other, especially at the times when those intellectuals were most active. What influence, if any, might each have exerted on local shrine cults, their beliefs and practices? Such an investigation might enable us to talk with Sonoda Minoru of the Shintōiization of shrines in ancient Japan. That is, the subverting of specific local shrines and their subjection to the influence of the central imperial cult. It might, again, prove more accurate to speak of a succession of attempts as Shintōiization in the classical, medieval, early modern and modern periods, since in each of them the national or universal agendas that constituted Shintō adopted different guises. Shintō, as articulated by the Watari priests, was different from that articulated by Yoshida Kanetomo, which in turn differed from that of, say, Edo nativists. Kuroda's critique discourages explorations of this sort, largely because of his insistence that Buddhism explains all. It is conceivable that in his enthusiasm to challenge the Shinto establishment view, he overlooks other dimensions to the dynamism of Japanese religious culture. One concerns the fraught question of the transformation of Buddhism in Japan. If we can divest ourselves of the idea that all shrine practice and all patterns of belief in kami necessarily constitute Shinto, it becomes easier, perhaps, to ask whether indigenous practice, influenced to a greater or lesser extent by Buddhism, Taoism, and Asiatic patterns of folk religious practice, did not in some profound way leave its mark, in its turn, on the various forms of Buddhist practice adopted in Japan. Was it not owing to more or less indigenous habits of faith disclosed in shrine practice that Japanese Buddhism adopted the unique forms that it did? Erneson points out that the distinction between the inhabited lowlands and the mountainous regions seems to have been particularly important for the development of religious symbolism and the acculturation of Buddhist ideas. And indeed, mountain cults of at least partly indigenous origin have shaped much of Japanese Buddhism. Also, from its very inception, Japanese Buddhism related to the kami in a very active way, incorporating them into Buddhist ritual and practice. there has been a tendency among specialists of Japanese Buddhism to marginalize kami-related aspects of Japanese Buddhism and exclude them from the real Buddhist tradition. However, the influence of kami ritual and mythology, especially on the esoteric Buddhist sects, Tendai and Shingon, was profound and continued over centuries. The comments of Kushida Ryoko in classic Shingon Mikkyo Seiritsu Kate no Kenkyu are worth heeding. Monks of the medieval period no longer regarded the kami classics as getten, works from outside the Buddhist tradition. Not only were the Buddhist works naiten, to these monks, the kami classics were the very essence of a Buddhist teaching. The mere fact that to this day most temples have a small shrine within their grounds demonstrates that kami cults have penetrated deeply into Buddhist practice, and the abundance of Buddhist theological texts, many of them still practically unexplored, dealing with subjects such as kami purification or the religious meaning of the three imperial regalia, demonstrates that topics that most would classify as Shintō also held the intense interest of Buddhist monks and their patrons over many centuries. Not only then can Buddhist ideas and ritual forms be seen to have influenced the shrine practice and Shinto thought through the medieval period, but Buddhist thought and practice too were transformed under the influence of kami cults. If we accept Kuroda's argument in its most extreme form and adopt his stance that there was no distinct Shinto tradition of thought during the pre-modern period, we render ourselves unable either to explain the process of amalgamation that dominated pre-modern Japanese religion, or to see the Shinto tradition that rose to prominence in the Edo and modern periods in its proper historical context. If one provisional conclusion can be drawn from the above, it is that the paths of the kami through Japanese history have been manifold. Kami have formed the focus of a great variety of local cults, many of which persisted largely unchanged through many centuries. They have played a central role in imperial ritual and continue to do so this day. They have penetrated deeply into the ritual and theology of Japanese Buddhism. And finally, they have inspired a range of theological constructs which are generally brought together under the term Shintō. The ideological agenda of a modern Shintō establishment that we define as rooted in reverence for, or at least identification with, the imperial institution, is but one in a long succession of three different categories of Shintō, each with a radically different agenda. This establishment view, which as demonstrated by the essays of Isomae Junichi, Nitta Hitoshi, and others in this volume, was itself a product of very specific historical circumstances, imposes on all kami cults and the hierarchical blueprint which categorizes all kami-related phenomena in order of dismissing importance as constituting, leading to, or branching off from a single way of the kami. It is an alternative to this view that we propose a multiplicity of ways of the kami, each grown out of different historical and social circumstances, and each with its own ritual and theological agenda. Such an approach promises not only to open our eyes to aspects of kami cults and Shintō traditions that have previously been ignored, but also to throw new light on the rituals, beliefs, and ideas of such cults and traditions that have been studied only through the lens of the above-mentioned notion that they ultimately formed part of a single way of the kami. It is only recently, and largely under the influence of Kuroda's work, that scholars have begun to look beyond the establishment view of Shintō and the kami. For the most part, moreover, their studies are confined to specialist journals and have yet to leave their imprint on the general understanding inside Japan and out of Japanese religions. The aim of this volume is to bring together in an accessible fashion a number of essays of Shintō and the kami that explore some of the issues raised above. The essays included in this book deal with kami and Shintō-related subjects, ranging from the beginning of the historical period, the 7th century, until roughly 1945. Regrettably, lack of space precludes us from doing justice to two important themes: the growth and development of so-called sect Shintō in pre-war Japan, and the complex dynamics of Shintō issues in the post-war period. We hope that there will be an opportunity to address these themes in separate volumes. The classical period is covered by 4 essays. Tim Barrett discusses the profound formative influence of Taoism on Shintō in early Japan. Barrett provides abundant historical examples of the relationship between Shintō and Taoism during this early period, and gives special attention to the adoption in Japan of the imperial title of Tenno, in Chinese, Tianhuang, its background, and its religious and political implications. Sonoda Minoru focuses on the relationship between shrine cults and nature mentioned above as one of the enduring traits of kami cults. His essay explores the ritual means by which early Japanese transformed their natural surroundings into a cultural landscape infused with religious and historical meaning. Referring to early mythological materials as well as early poetry, Sonoda uncovers the deep symbolic meaning of woods and forests in shrine worship. Nelly Naumann discusses the establishment and the functions of the Jingikan, or Department of the Affairs of the Deities, which was set up in the 7th century as part of contemporary attempts to recognize Japanese government along the lines of the Tang Chinese bureaucratic state. Naumann provides a detailed overview of the state cult of which this office was in charge, and of the Chinese and indigenous sources from which it derived. Alan Grappard closes this section with a discussion of the central role of both shrine and temple ritual in the Japanese state of the Heian period. He addresses this issue from various angles, offering analysis of the institutional framework within which rituals were performed, the political dimension of this body of rituals, and their economic significance. Grappard opens up a tantalizing perspective of these matters. Grappard opens up a tantalizing perspective of these matters by calling upon us to reconsider ritual in terms of production, ingestion, and digestion. Topics from the medieval period are discussed in 2 essays by Mark Teeuwen and Bernard Scheidt. Teeuwen explores the functions that kami, and especially Amaterasu, performed in esoteric Buddhist thought and ritual, which, as pointed out by Kuroda, formed the dominant religious paradigm of the age. Discussing esoteric Buddhist forms of kami purification, shrine worship, and kami court ritual, Teeuwen describes the emergence of a Buddhist kami discourse that was instrumental in the subsequent development of Shintō into an independent religion. Bernard Scheidt's essay provides an analysis of Yoshida Shintō's central doctrinal text, the 15th century Yuitsu Shintō Myobo Yoshu. He demonstrates in detail how esoteric, exoteric, and ritual elements are revealed in this text, and discusses how the dichotomy of open versus secret defines its structure. Scheidt's analysis not only sheds new light on Yoshida Shintō thought and ritual, but also offers an example on how texts of this Kenmitsu type, which constitute the majority of Japanese medieval religious literature, can be fruitfully read. The section of the Edo period is opened by Wim Booth. Booth offers a detailed study on the basis of primary sources of the deification of Tokugawa Ieyasu as Doshogu Daigongen in the early 17th century. Comparing this event with the earlier deification of Toyotomi Hideyoshi and of Fujiwara no Kamatari, quoted as precedents in the polemics that accompanied Ieyasu's deification, Booth sheds new light on its religious significance and argues against the interpretation that this deification was a politically inspired exercise of Bakufu propaganda. Brian Bocking focuses on Sanja Taksen, a distinctive type of hanging scroll inscribed with oracles of the Ise, Kasuga, and Usa Hachiman shrines. Bocking uses this scroll, produced through some 6 centuries, as a window through which to view the dynamic development of Japanese religions over this long period of time. Bocking's choice of focus eloquently reveals the limitations inherent in the conventional method of tracing Buddhist and Shintō history as 2 separate fields of study. The transition from Edo Japan to Meiji Japan is the underlying theme of the essays by Nicola Liskutin and Walthall and John Breen. The transition from Edo Japan to Meiji Japan is the underlying theme of the essays by Nicola Liskutin and Walthall and John Breen. Liskutin studies the diverse religious phenomena that gave meaning to the sacred mountain of Iwaki in Tsugaru. She analyzes the Iwaki cults in terms of the mountain's sacred topography and explores the religious dynamics sustained by the Iwaki Shrine Temple complex in the pre-modern period. Her particular concern is to demonstrate how this dynamism expired and how the religious complexity of the site unraveled under the edicts of the early Meiji state. And Walthall explores the Shintō thought of Hirata Asutane from a new perspective. She asks how Hirata's ideas were transmitted to and enacted by his posthumous disciples in the Ina Valley. The religious and political fervor of these Hirata followers of different social classes found concrete expression in the creation of a shrine to Hirata. Walthall exposes the cultural and intellectual milieu of this little-studied rural community and locates in the context of late Tokugawa history. Finally, John Breen takes a new look at the separation policies of the Restoration government. His focus falls less on the edicts and their consequences than on the people who formulated them, the ideologues and the bureaucrats whose support was essential to their implementation. He questions the received wisdom of the Shintō perpetrator, Buddhist victim framework, and finds evidence of a more complex history in the published writings of ideologues and bureaucrats, as well as in the experiences of a provincial shrine priest. Nitta Hitoshi, in the first of 4 essays to deal with the late 19th and early 20th century Shintō, explores the dynamics of the process that resulted in Shintō being defined as non-religious. Nitta finds the key dynamic to lie not so much in the duplicity of Meiji bureaucrats seeking to circumvent the Meiji constitution's provisions for religious freedom. Still less, at least in the early Meiji, did it lie in the Shintōists themselves. Nitta proposes rather that we locate the origins of the idea in the logic of Shinshu Buddhists. In short, Buddhists' role in the creation of what we now know as State Shintō was critical. Sakamoto Kuremaru analyzes this State Shintō construct from an institutional perspective. The creation of the Jinja-kyoku in the 20th century was a landmark development as, for the first time since the very early Meiji years, shrines and priests were brought under the wing of a dedicated government office. The promise of an improvement in fortunes was hardly realized, however. The government gave little commitment to shrines and their priests, despite vigorous campaigning by shrine clergy through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. We overlook at our peril, Sakamoto argues, the ideological and emotional distance between the bureaucrats and the Shintōists who staffed such institutions at the Jingin. We overlook at our peril, Sakamoto argues, the ideological and emotional distance between the bureaucrats and the Shintōists who staffed such institutions as the Jingin. Kamata Toji divides his attentions between 2 men of unrivaled stature in the Shinto world. The 20th century ethnologist Orikuchi Shinobu and the 19th century thinker Hirata Atsutane. Kamata adopts what might be called a psycho-historical approach to expose the obsession of both men with the other realm. Where some have suggested the influences of Christianity or Pure Land Buddhism, Kamata uncovers a dimension of an entirely different order. Was it not, he asks, because of their physical disfigurement and the accompanying psychological torment that both Hirata and Orikuchi suffered, that explains their turning from this world and seeking solace in the other? The disfigurement of Kamata's title might be seen as referring both to the physiognomy of the man he studies and to the effect of that physiognomy on their brands of Japanese nativism. Isomae Junichi, finally, highlights the thought of Tanaka Yoshito, who, as the founding father of modern Shinto studies, was a little known yet central figure in the history of Shinto's modern development. Tanaka was driven by a desire to construe for Shinto a metaphysics that would enable it to stand shoulder to shoulder with Western religion and philosophy. He became one of the leading theoreticians of state Shinto. Isonae's essay sheds light not only on the formation of state Shinto thought, but also on its sources, its institutional foundations, and the limits to its influence.